Hello, this is a podcast for cyber ethics, building on what we were talking about in the lecture around conflict management online. I'll go over some of the ground again and then extend it a little bit from what we looked at in the lecture. For any of the names you're not sure of, if you look at the PowerPoints, they have the spellings for the various different names in there. One of the things we touched on is the idea that social media particularly generates new forms of conflict, new styles of people becoming irascible with each other. It's a bit of a debatable one whether the internet makes people more aggressive than they otherwise would be. There are theories in both directions on that one. We'll touch very briefly on one of them as we go along. But as per the PowerPoint definitions, if we start off briefly by mentioning the idea that flame wars, just to define the terms of flame war, is an exaggerated fight taking place in social media, where somebody says something, well, types something, and others take offence at it, and then it very, very quickly escalates. So it's not a standard small spat or a minor difference of opinion. It's something that really blows up out of control very, very quickly and sort of goes from 0 to 60 in terms of things like people making threats, getting verbally abusive, and a disagreement on one thing suddenly turning into a disagreement on 35 different things. And it's that kind of acceleration that moves it beyond a mere disagreement into a flame war. Flame baiting is a technique used on different sites in which someone joins a social media site. They comment on a blog, they're on Facebook, they're on Twitter, something of that sort. And they are deliberately trying to cause a fight. So that they're not just happening to take offence to what somebody said in a genuine spirit of being shocked or upset or offended or whatever. They are pretending either to take offence at something innocuous and blowing it out of proportion, or just as often they are deliberately saying the most controversial, rudest, offensive thing that they can dream up, just to see if they can get a reaction from other people who are also using that social media website. So they're trying to start a fight. And it's sometimes referred to as trolling, going in and causing problems where problems otherwise would not exist. Some people do it out of sheer boredom. They're 15 years old, they've got nothing better to do with their time. Then it's a bit like going up to an ant's nest and poking it with a stick just to see them running everywhere. Some people genuinely enjoy causing a bit of mayhem, a bit of chaos, watching the fur fly. They'll say something that's terribly sexist or racist or offensive in some other way, not out of any great conviction in that particular point of view, but just because they know other people will get upset and they want to see the reactions that go on. That said, there are arguments that flame baiting can sometimes be used as a political tool, and it might be construed as an ethical tool to use, or at least it brings up the question, is it an ethical tool to use? So, to give you an example, there are lots of websites dedicated to doing things, promoting points of view and so on, that many other people find upsetting and offensive. You could have a very far right, or for that matter a very far left, political website that is quite hateful and quite angry. You have websites that are dedicated to big game hunting, to in favour of vivisection, things that people get very emotive and feel very strongly about. Some individuals regard it as ethical to go onto these sites and to try and close them down. And they try to close them down not by hacking into them and doing clever things with coding and so on, but by causing social mayhem. So they'll try and ensure that any attempt to discuss whatever the subject matter happens to be gets totally sidelined and railroaded, and it becomes a non-stop screaming match about something else completely. The idea being a lot of the people who go onto those sites to have discussions about their preferred subject will get so bored with the constant fighting and squabbling and name calling and shrieking and shouting that they'll just get bored and leave it, and the numbers of people using that website will just plummet so dramatically that the website becomes unviable, and the users, whoever runs the website, will end up just closing it down and giving up and going home in despair. And then the person who has done that sabotaging can say that they have successfully succeeded in closing down a website on some subject they find terribly offensive. If they do it by themselves, it's called flame baiting. Some people will get their friends to join in with them and do it, and that's called brigading. So if there's 2, 3, 4, 5 of you, all looking onto a website, all trying to start fights and cause mayhem and clutter the place up with lots of really abusive arguments, that's brigading. The effect is much the same. One of the ethical difficulties with this is that whilst somebody of a more, shall we say, liberal progressive point of view might approve of an individual using this technique to shut down a Ku Klux Klan website or a neo-Nazi chat room or something of that sort, that technique can equally be used to close down any site. You could get someone who, for whatever strange reason, decides that they want to target knitting clubs or cake baking websites and shut them down. Or they could target more progressive left-wing sites. So they could go on to a chat room in favour of drag hunting and start arguments about the joys of killing small furry animals to shut that down. They could go onto a website that's trying to promote racial tolerance and use the same techniques to shut that down. So the difficulty then becomes, if you justify the technique, how do you develop an ethos which directs it only to certain forms of usage and not to others? In other words, if you can, going back to the discussions we had a while ago now about punching a Nazi, if you can punch a Nazi, you can punch more liberal mainstream people too. Somebody, if a left-wing person can justify punching a right-wing person, why can't it be done the other way around? Clearly there are people who do it the other way around. And how, either you object to all punching and say all of this is beyond the pale, or you're going to get into some very sticky wicket saying it's okay to punch that person, but it's not okay to punch that person. And how you develop an ethos that effectively and cogently and coherently enables you to direct a somewhat controversial technique to disrupt groups you don't like, but stops those groups disrupting things that you do like. That's where it gets awkward, that's where it gets difficult to sort of make a cohesive argument. Can be done, but it's not a straightforward process. If we're thinking of factors that cause arguments online, it's something that psychologists have studied in recent years, and they argue a number of different factors come into play. Miscommunication is a key one. And it's something, it's not unique to the internet, but you certainly say it is wildly exaggerated on the internet, particularly in a certain context. Miscommunication is when I say one thing and you totally misunderstand me, you think I said something else, and so you get offended at what you think I said, not what I actually have said. Part of miscommunication, and this is where we get sort of internet specific, is that an awful lot of human communication has evolved for most of our history to be face-to-face. Back in the days when there was no internet, there were no telephones, hardly anyone could read or write, almost all communication had to take place with two people sitting down talking to each other and looking at each other. Therefore, most of our communicative techniques as a human species are tone of voice, body language, being able to read into silences, so it's not only what somebody does say, it's also what they don't say. And there have been various arguments by psychologists that we actually end up communicating more by what we don't say than by what we do say. So you can have an awful lot divined through face-to-face communication that's very hard to explain instance by instance. We just kind of assimilate information so rapidly it's hard to break it down into individual levels. If you're trying to write that information in a letter, in a novel, what have you, it's quite hard to describe all the unspoken communication, the body language, the accent, the hints, the nuances that make up face-to-face human communication. If you're trying to translate that into a text, into a Twitter, into a Facebook ramble, it's even harder still. And you do have all these emojis and smiley faces and all that palaver to help people indicate when they're joking, when they're being serious, when they're angry, when they're sad, and so on. But it's still not very easy to fully communicate in the written medium. And so it's very easy for one person to misread a joke as a serious statement, or somebody else to think that a cry for help is actually a flippant remark, and totally misread what's going on. And so that leads to arguments developing because of the awkwardness of written communication as a means of processing, particularly if we factor in speed. And I don't mean snorting amphetamine. I mean the speed at which we now communicate online. We're thinking Edwardian ladies writing genteel letters to each other. It might take an hour to write that letter, and then you had to wait a fortnight for a response, and then it's a slow process. Therefore, you've got to think about what you want to say, and you've got time to think, oh no, I don't really mean it that way, and you rip the letter up and you start again. It's a slower, more thoughtful, more considered process. Nowadays, of course, with the internet, you can bang out a response in 30 seconds before your brain has hardly had time to kick into gear. And so responses are flying back and forth so rapidly, it begs the question as to how much real thought, consideration, reflection, contemplation has gone into that style of communication. Was it just sort of blurted out and then it's easily misread? So miscommunication is a problem on that one. The other factors that psychologists like to talk about are de-individuation. When people are part of a larger group, a crowd, a large social media following, something like that, it's easy to forget you are you. You are an individual. You are separate from the crowd. So you get swept up in the standards, the values, the mores of the group. So if everyone is talking in a certain way, behaving in a certain way, it's very easy to kind of get swept up in that and feel that you've got to communicate in a similar way in order to fit in. So if they're all telling dodgy jokes, you may feel you've got to tell a dodgy joke to fit in. If they're all using 15-syllable complicated words, you might feel you've got to. If you don't know any, perhaps you just fall into silence because you don't want to appear thick in front of the group or whatever. So it has an impact on you, and you kind of merge and lose yourself in the crowd, and may end up talking in ways or talking about things that normally you wouldn't do. And so you become capable of behaviours you're not normally capable of, which could include getting very, very aggressive. The other one we'll mention is anonymity. The idea that the people reading your messages don't really know who you are. They don't know where you live. They don't know what you do for a living. They don't maybe even know what you look like. You could be using a completely false name. Therefore, you can say things which will never be tracked back to you. Now, we know, obviously, that it is possible to find out who people are. If you are sufficiently internet savvy, you can work out somebody's identity, track them back. But for an awful lot of people, either they don't know it or they quickly forget it in the heat of the moment. They get used to the fact that everyone thinks they're somebody else entirely, or they've got no idea who they are. So they type away and they say all sorts of things that maybe, if they were held personally accountable for what they're saying, they would not say. In the same sense, if they were face to face, would they be as rude to somebody's face as it's easy to become when you don't see them, they don't see you, you don't really know who they are, they don't really know who you are, and you lose yourself, and therefore you lose your sense of compassion, of empathy, and of personal responsibility in the process. So you're starting to lose your moral values, your moral standards. something that perhaps is rather unique and peculiar to online communication rather than face-to-face communication. We looked in the lecture a little bit about this idea of social queuing, that when large numbers of people come together for an event, an activity of some sort, there are cues of how to behave. Some of these cues are things you learn as you grow up, some of them you just kind of pick it up as you go along. So the way you behave at a classical music concert is different from the way you would behave at a heavy metal concert. They're still both music events, but the whole kind of behaviour, standards of activity, what you do, what you don't do, changes. And if it's the first time you've ever been to one of those concerts, you'll probably pick up relatively quickly how you're expected to behave at that kind of an event. Some large events are a bit more spontaneous. You're at the big supermarket and a fire breaks out and suddenly everyone's running around and nobody knows what to do, and then it becomes a bit more sort of off the cuff in terms of how you behave, because for those sorts of events there aren't necessarily much in the line of social cues as to what you're meant to do, what you're not meant to do. In a similar vein, not only for physical gatherings of people, but if you log on to, say, a website of some sort, and it tells you that you are one of 10,000 people using that website, you are part of a virtual mob, a virtual group, and you'll pick up on social cues by reading the posts and so forth about how most people in that group behave. Of course, the chances are that if there is 10,000 people, they're not all talking at once. Maybe only a tiny fraction of those people are typing, but you take them as a representative selection, a representative cue of how you're expected to behave in that sort of virtual reality setting. But cueing is quite difficult to pick up on purely in the written format, and that's an issue. Most of the cues we pick up on in social events are how people dress, how they're stood, their body language, their mannerisms. We watch their actions, where do they go, what do they do, kind of things you just don't get if you're online, unless it's in some kind of YouTube type video conferencing. Even then it's very limited as to what you get in terms of information. Conflict issues. In the PowerPoint there's a very grim photograph from the 1960s of a little child, a black child, a little white child in a Ku Klux Klan costume outfit, who's going up to a black police officer who is forming a sort of a part of a shield wall around the fight that's about to break out with this Ku Klux Klan protest march. And his only kid, looks about 2 or 3 years old, is just sort of waving at the police officer, obviously hasn't a clue what's going on. And it's that idea, it's a very dramatic picture, but it's the idea that a lot of hostility is learnt. No one is born a screaming racist. Nobody is born regionally misogynistic or misandritic. No one is born with those levels of specified hostility. But we acquire them. We have to learn them. Some of them we start learning from a very young age because our parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, what have you, teach us to like the people they like and dislike the people they like. So if they have particular issues around race, around religion, around social class, around that lot from the village down the road they don't like very much, or whatever it happens to be, we'll tend to pick up on those hostilities. As adults we may agree with them or we may disagree with them, but it does beg some interesting ethical questions which we'll explore on another occasion about how we understand the ethical differences in someone who has been raised in a hateful environment and has never known anything different, who just perpetuates it as an adult, and someone who does know different, who has experienced other ways of thinking and being, who chooses to join that sort of hateful, hostile movement that promotes a very aggressive form of conflict. Do they both have the same level of moral culpability, or does the person making the choice have more culpability than the person who knows nothing else? How do we respond to them? it begs a whole raft of questions which we'll explore on other occasions. If we come on to the issue of doxing, which is something we explored in the lecture, doxing, just to clarify the term, is finding out personal information about an individual that you disagree with or dislike in some context, and posting it in a public forum online so that other people can find out where they live, where that person works, what their phone number is, bank details, are they married, do they have kids, all this kind of thing, stuff that they might not want Joe Public to know about. And the idea is that once you have put their information out there, you then wash your hands of it, and whatever happens next, people say, well, it's not my problem. Except that unethically, that's a real minefield, because the whole point of putting that information out there is clearly that you want something not terribly pleasant to happen to that person. And that can operate at a number of levels. One of the examples given in the PowerPoint was of a young lad who was taking part in the far right-wing rally that took place in Charlottesville in America a little while ago. Somebody recognised his face from a news broadcast, and that's so-and-so, and they quickly put his details up online. And so it was found out which university he was studying at and all sorts of other things about it. On consequence of which, a lot of people then sent emails and letters and phone calls and what have you to that university saying, oh, why have you got this so-and-so studying there, why don't you do something about it? And it's now reached the point where he has quit his university course. Comes from a very wealthy family, so he's not exactly living in a cardboard box or anything melodramatic as a result of this, but it has had an impact on his life. And other people, old people who were also taking part in that rally, many of them have been identified, and there's been an active campaign to identify them, with people putting photos on social media saying, oh, does anyone know this bloke holding the burning cross? Who is he? Where does he live? What does he do? People's employers have been targeted with again, campaigns, phone calls, emails, so that a lot of them have been sacked. Some of them have been estranged from their relatives who turned around saying, well, we had no idea Uncle Bob was off on this protest rally. We didn't know he thought like that or anything. We don't want anything to do with him anymore. There's been all sorts of consequences for people, which is the intention of doxing, that there will be consequences. If there was no consequences, there'd be no point in doing it. So far, as far as I'm aware at least, none of those consequences have been violent. No one's been beaten up. No one's been murdered. That's not to say it couldn't happen, of course. If you knew someone who lives a few doors down from you, you suddenly see on a social media website, is a leading luminary in some extremist ultra right-wing group, might you go down and thump them? Or possibly. So things like that do happen, they can happen. And so people doxing potentially could be placing other people at risk of violence, and other people maybe even at risk of murder, depending on the nature of what it is that they are posting about. And again, as with flame baiting and so forth, we come back to this moral dilemma that a technique that can be used in one context can also be used in other contexts. So a fair number of people might not be terribly upset, shall we say, if some lad who joins an extremist, racist, right-wing protest march loses his position in university. They might think, serves him right. However, what's to stop a person of more militant extremist beliefs who really doesn't like gay people, who sees a gay pride rally and goes, oh, I know him, I recognise him, and then starts a campaign, gets their friends involved, puts that person's name and address and details up on a website and tries to get that person pressured in some way. So maybe they lose their job as a school teacher. They lose their friends and family who didn't know that individual was gay. It does beg the question, why would you go on a gay pride march and get your face on TV and if you're from it? But that's a moot point. They had not told, but they are then exposed by a campaign to cause them problems, because again, doxing is intentionally trying to cause problems by giving away personal details of an individual. So you could disagree with someone for their extreme racial views, but equally you could have someone who just doesn't like gay people, doesn't like the fact that someone is in a pro interracial group. Someone who's hard right, who doesn't like to know that some other person is mixing in a group which seeks racial harmony. So in either direction they could campaign to pressurise and bring unpleasant consequences for that individual. How do you regulate ethically the application of a really quite dangerous technique of disrupting somebody else's life only in favour of political causes that you yourself approve of, and prevent those of a diametrically opposed political point of view also using the same techniques to cause disruption to people that you don't think should be disrupted? It's not a clear-cut, easy thing. Again, we're in the same difficulty. It's a technique that can be used in different directions, and it can cause all sorts of problems in all sorts of ways. Can it be done ethically? That's the difficulty. And as with usual, I'm not going to give you an answer on that one. It's for you to reflect on and think about. Can it be used? Can it not? Moving on from that, there's an ethical thinker, blogger, a feminist campaigner called Flavia Zoden, who is mentioned in the PowerPoint. She's talking about another technique which is often used online as well as in face-to-face communication, called calling out. Calling out is when somebody says something that you do not like. They express a political point of view, perhaps, that you don't agree with, that you're not comfortable with. And so you call them out by saying, I don't agree with you. I'm not happy with what you've just said. I'm not happy with what you've just done. She distinguishes two levels. She says the effective level, what for her is the ethical level, is to do this privately. So you go up to that person and say, look, that thing you said yesterday, I thought that was very sexist, racist, homophobic, whatever the thing was. I'm not comfortable with what you said. Do you think you need to change your views on this issue? Etc. And you try and do it in a polite manner, a non-confrontational manner, and encourage that person to reflect, to change, to move on, to take ownership for any hurt or upset they might have caused, saying or doing whatever it was that they said or they did. What she regards as a more difficult, contentious area and frequently an unethical area is public calling out, where someone, particularly in a social media setting, stands up in front of others, either physically, like a room full of people, or social media, posts online, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, and says, I don't agree with so-and-so, I think they're terribly wrong, I think they're awful and sexist and racist and bigoted and this and that and the other, and makes a big public display of it. There are several reasons why she disagrees with this. Firstly, she is arguing that it's performative. That is to say, there is a degree of hamming it up for her. So is this person the one doing the calling out? Are they genuinely concerned that someone's points of view are very prejudicial, might be causing her an upset to themselves or to whoever, and are trying to change it? Or are they just trying to score public points? It's what's sometimes referred to as virtue signalling, where somebody wants to be seen to hold a set of views. They don't necessarily want to do an awful lot about it, always, but it's important for them to be seen, that everyone thinks they are terribly pro this, pro that, pro whatever else. And so they make a great show of wearing the badges and being seen to stand up and condemn things they don't agree with. And it's an act, it's a front, it's a show, it's a bit like a peacock showing its tail feathers. It's all about being seen more than it is about genuinely doing anything privately, discreetly, and effectively. And so then it takes this idea that it is a kind of one-upmanship, if we can call it that, a point scoring, look at me, look at how liberal I am, look at how challenging I am. And it generates hostility, she argues, towards the person who's being called out. Are they likely to change their views, or will they just get kind of defensive and back off and get a bit stroppy and say, don't you call me such and such a thing? And therefore they dig their heels in rather than reflecting, considering, changing their views, maybe not saying whatever it is they said or not doing whatever it is they did. Is it effective? Is one issue. Or does it just put backs up, which is what Zoden is arguing. It mostly puts backs up. Is it reflective of genuine views on the part of the person saying it? Her argument is that if it was a genuine reflection of views, you'd want to deal with this discreetly. You wouldn't be running around going, oh, look at me being liberal, which she feels is ineffective. A lot of she gives us examples and comes at it from a more feminist angle, but you could apply it to other kinds of contexts as well, where an individual is falling over themselves to be seen in a certain light, and she regards that style of calling out as inappropriate. So to intents and purposes, if it's a private email between two individuals, she's fine with that. If it's something slapped up on Facebook, on Twitter, on Snapchat, on a blog where half the world can see it, that she is uncomfortable with and feels is counterproductive. And unethical, I suppose, when we're saying that. So something to reflect on there, whether that is suitable. One area of potential disagreement some people might have with that is what's termed anti-locution. So a word that was used by psychologist Adorno back in the 50s and 60s when he was studying racism and antisemitism and various forms of bigotry. Anti-locution is to say horrible things about a group of people. So not so much a horrible thing about one particular person, you're boring and dreary or whatever, but to have a group, go at a group, whether that's an ethnic group, a religious group, all men or women, whatever, lumping everyone together in a group and saying horrible things about that group. He made the argument, Adorno, that prejudice comes in a variety of levels, that it starts with anti-locution and it builds up. It doesn't have to go all the way up to the top. Sometimes it reaches a certain point and goes no further. But it starts with anti-locution and it moves on to hostility. Then you've got things like aggression, denying people services. Ultimately, he felt in the long run that the final end could be outright murderousness, genocide. He was quite interested in things like the Holocaust and so on. But again, his argument is that at one extreme you have mass murder and slaughter. At the other extreme, where it begins, you have anti-locution. And you don't end up at this end without first starting at this end. So, whilst not all acts of anti-locution, in fact the vast majority of acts of anti-locution, do not lead to violence and murder and assault, nonetheless some of them do, was his argument. So some people might have the notion that if an individual is verbally hostile or abusive, they need to be challenged. Zodan isn't disagreeing with that, she's just saying that the challenge should be in private, not a public one. However, other people have countered by saying, if it goes on in private, then people affected by that horrible action or horrible speech don't necessarily know it's happened. So let's say you've got someone who stands up and says something that's terribly racist on Facebook, for argument's sake. And that message is read by 1,000 people, some of whom are black or Asian or whatever, and are offended by what Joe Bloggs has said. Maybe Joe Bloggs' best friend has had a quiet word in private with Joe Bloggs and said this is unacceptable and you should retract what you said. Maybe it's effective. But will the other 999 people who've read that message know that this private conversation has gone on? Presumably not. they might feel hurt, got at, attacked, undermined, what have you, by what Joe Bloggs has said. Therefore, some people make the argument that there is a need for some kind of public statement of people standing up and saying to Joe Bloggs, "Oi, I don't agree with what you've just said," so that the other 998, whatever number we're at now, who have seen that message will also not only see the hostile message, but will also see the statement of disagreement with it, and feel reassured that even if Joe Bloggs is hostile, at least Gladys Jones, who has posted up the disagreeing message, is friendly, is counteracting the hostility. So there's different ethical approaches to this one as to what is the most effective way of dealing with that kind of public hostility, public conflict, public disagreement. Carl Miller, nearly finished, Carl Miller went on to say that things like social media are particularly popular with groups that are in society that are traditionally voiceless. Which groups are voiceless depends which culture, which period of history you're looking at. But there are frequently groups of people in society who are not widely listened to. Either there's just not many of them to start with, or the wider society dislikes them in some capacity. So even if there's a lot of people, so if you take a very sexist society, a very patriarchal society, where men's views are regarded as much more important than women's views, even if half the country are women, nonetheless their views may be downplayed or not sought. No one consults them men don't consult them in the first place, and things like that. Or it may be a genuinely small group of people whom the rest of society just never even occurs to them to talk to in the first place. Miller's argument is that with these groups, social media, as it has come into existence, provides an opportunity that has never existed before in history. It provides an opportunity to communicate. They can communicate with each other in the way that people who are perhaps a bit underground in some way might have difficulty making contact. So if you've got gay people in Saudi Arabia, for example, can't go along to gay pubs, gay bars, how do they ever meet other gay people without risking arrest and execution? Something like social media could provide them with a way to meet up, make contact, just talk to each other as much as anything else, without risking obvious self-exposure. Doesn't mean the groups couldn't be infiltrated and they might still be hauled into court, but it's less obviously risky than a public meeting in a public place. But also other types of groups can not only find one another, but they can also start coordinating how to make their voices heard. They can say, let's have a campaign march, let's go on a parade, let's put leaflets through doors, let's send a petition to a politician, let's do this, let's do that. They can reflect on ways in which they can make their needs, their opinions, their wishes known to the wider society. And they can do it with a speed, with an efficiency, with a level of organisation that would have been nigh on impossible 50 years ago, where everything would have been much, much slower. So one of the effects of the internet and social media is to speed up the potential for social change, for challenges to traditional ways of doing things. Again, that can work in both directions. So that could work with an ethnic minority that's been very oppressed, trying to seek better treatment, better legal status, etc. So it could work in a very positive direction, or you could have paedophiles coming together to network with one another and try to challenge or subvert the status quo in a way that advantages them, but is clearly a much more dubious coming together of a minority group than trying to get civil rights for an ethnic minority, which is a much more positive thing. So it can go in different directions, but it becomes a voice for the voiceless. in all sorts of ways, and that is a kind of a revolutionary technique. One of the consequences of that, from Miller's point of view, is that when the voiceless get their voice and are heard, the majority in a society can react with surprise, they can react with shock, they may react with outrage, they may be very disapproving. They can eventually lead to more positive outcomes as they sort of calm down a bit and listen to what's being said to them. But as with the early suffragette movement and the kind of reactions they got from a lot of wider society, we don't want anything to do with this, it's all, be quiet and stop carrying on about it, that you can get conflict generated amongst the majority group when they realise the silent group is no longer silent, is now starting to make its voice heard. So that can be a consequence. Karen Franklin talks about hate crimes in this context, which kind of goes with it to some extent, and talks about there being 4 major motivations for hate crimes, both in terms of actually beating somebody up in the street, but also posting horrible things online and different levels of hate crime. She talks about ideology. As with that little child we were mentioning earlier who was raised within a Ku Klux Klan family, you might be brought up on an ideology that teaches you to hate that bunch of people over there. And even if you've never met any of them, nonetheless you grew up with the belief that for this, that, or the other political, religious, whatever other reasons, they are terrible people and you've got to be wary of them and they're dangerous and they need controlling. So it conveys a whole set of beliefs from the moment you are part of that group as to how this mistrusted bunch of humans must be treated. She said a lot of people also get involved for thrills. If you're just one of those rather aggressive people who likes an opportunity to shout, scream and thump people, you don't much care who it is you thump or what it is you're shouting about, you just like shouting and thumping, then getting involved in hate crime is an excuse to vent spleen for some people. I have known individuals who have gone on marches and demonstrations without a clue what they just saw one. They're in a coffee shop, and they saw a march going past, and they joined in because they like the chance for punch up, and they've got no idea what on earth the march is about. They just see it as an opportunity to get a bit testosterone-y and let rip. So there are people like that in the world. Peer pressure, she argues, even if you're not brought up in a particular ideology, if the people you work with, your next door neighbours, etc., are all of a certain opinion and they don't like some other group and are often quite hostile to them, even if there's not much of a cohesive ideology, you could be pressurised into going along with it. So the kind of thing that in the, say, the 1960s, 70s, a particular workplace was entirely white, no black people had ever worked there, and there was a general resentment of any black people joining up. And these days you might just as well be Polish people or whatever, or Latvian people, and there could be hostility towards what's seen as outside foreign faces joining a place of work. No one's got a particularly cohesive political movement around it, it's just a general resentment of strangers. And so somebody who joins that workplace may feel as if they've got to go along with that overall atmosphere. So that's kind of what she's arguing, kind of peer pressure sort of thing. And lastly, which does overlap with ideology, she said there is self-defense. A lot of people are told by friends, by family, by newspapers, by politicians, by all sorts of different sources, that a group of people, that group over there, are a danger to them. The usual things that you get in a lot of tabloids: so-and-so group are coming over here, they're taking our jobs, they're taking our houses, they are sponging off our taxes and sending tax rates soaring through the ceiling, they're doing this, they're doing that, they're committing crimes. Whatever the thing may be, people are convinced that members of Group X are a threat, in whatever capacity: economic threat, criminal threat, social threat, all sorts of different ways it may take place. Again, there may not be some big overarching political ideology. There may be just that they've read in so many newspapers, heard it on the news, heard it down the pub, heard it here, heard it there, that bunch are a threat, that they come to believe it, and they feel at risk. they are going to lose their job. They're going to get mugged in the street. Their kids will get hooked on drugs as a result of socialising with this group, whatever it might be. They're worried about something, and so they get defensive, they get hostile, and that leads into acts of hate crime because they have been convinced. And certainly the political bit and the self-defence bit, we could argue, exist in social media in terms of how information is disseminated and put out there, in terms of what websites people read, what memes they see, what information they get coming into their heads that makes them believe a certain thing, and then they ultimately act upon it. Last little bit to finish on. Do web hosts, that is to say companies, things like GoDaddy and so on, who host websites, millions and millions of websites for businesses, for hobby groups, for bird spotting clubs, for churches, for this, for that, for the next thing, do they have an ethical responsibility to police and do something about possible hate-related groups that they may be hosting? Most of these sites host so many groups that they don't individually know what each one is about. And they often have policies saying, oh, if you want to have a web domain with us, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do the other, which may include things like hate crimes. But there's one thing to have a policy, there's another to enforce it. And the ethical debate comes in, to what extent should these companies be held responsible for allowing hate crimes to be promoted through their sites? So if they've got an extreme racial group, an extreme misogynistic group, an extreme whatever type of group, must they shut that group down and refuse to host it? And there are grey areas around activities that to some people are hate crimes and to others are not. So if you've got a site that sells historical memorabilia, for example, they're selling ration books from the war or something like that, an auction site. If they sell SS hat insignia and Nazi badges, is that a hate crime? The people buying it, well, I suppose some of them might be museums and what have you, but there's a fair chance that the people who want to buy that stuff may be of a certain political outlook themselves. Therefore, in selling it, is that website selling hate-related objects? Or are they just selling historical period objects? And it's an ambiguous one in where does it end, where does it begin? If you're selling some, let's say a pair of gloves that was once owned by a woman who ran a slave plantation in the Barbados, is a pair of gloves just a pair of gloves? Or is this a memorabilia attached to slave owning and therefore a hate crime? The Nazi military insignia is maybe a bit more in your face, but there are other areas where it gets more ambiguous. Is it or isn't it a hateful thing? Is it just a pair of gloves? It's a difficult one to argue. It's a difficult one to define. And if it is a hate crime to some people, are they then justified in pressurising the host site that's providing a service for this auction club or whatever it is to take place on, to shut down that site? Because to them, they are upset, they are offended, they are worried about what this auction site or whatever thing may be is engaged in. Or is it an overreaction? Is it purely down to the laws of the country in which the web host exists? If the individual site is in a different country from the one in which the host company is situated, should it be the laws of the country of the host site or the laws of the country of this individual website that's bought space on the host site that take precedence in deciding what is a hate crime and what isn't a hate crime? How should that be policed? That's as much a legal question as it is an ethical question, of course. But it's a complex area in which a lot of debate goes on, and there are no clear-cut guidelines or measures, but something to reflect on anyway. And I say, have a read through the website, the PowerPoint, and you kind of reflect on some of the issues discussed there, and if there's anything further you want to pick up on, we can discuss it in class when I see you next. Okay?